Welcome, everyone, to the Center for Global Development. I'm Amanda Glassman. I'm a senior fellow here. Today's topic on understanding the political economy of statistics and statistical capacity is essential in today's so-called post-truth world for the work of all of us, governments, development banks like the Inter-American Development Bank, and civil society groups, including think tanks like CGD. Basic facts, statistics, must be right in order to enable productive debates, better policy, and to be able to avoid confusion. Winston Churchill, apparently in 1941, when he was appointing his chief statistician, said, "Statistics should be able to be accepted and used without question." That does sound like the good old days, doesn't it? But ours and others' work have found serious concerns with the accuracy, timeliness, and availability of official statistics in many parts of the world. Statistical offices vary in their technical sophistication, their capacity, and their ability to resist political pressure. In our work, we've identified independence and incentives, whether they're financial, fiscal, or political, as key issues to address to make progress. And political economy is at the heart of these challenges. And that's why I'm very pleased to host this book talk by friends and former colleagues at the Inter-American Development Bank. This book is called Who Wants to Know? The Political Economy of Statistical Capacity in Latin America. And I'm certain that although this is focused on Latin America, the insights will be important elsewhere in the world. So we'll kick off with Santiago Levy, who is a vice president for sectors and knowledge at the Inter-American Development Bank, and we'll follow with Jose Antonio Mejia, who will give a brief overview of the book's main messages. You have all of their bios in this handout, so I won't go into a lot of detail, and we'll follow that with a panel, and I'll introduce each of them by their title. But let's get started so we can move to the discussion, which is the best part. Thanks.
So good morning, everybody. And let me begin by thanking the Center for Global Development, particularly Sue and Amanda. Thank you for hosting us, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to present this book from the Inter-American Development Bank. And I'm pleased to see some colleagues from the IMF and some colleagues from the World Bank, or ex-World Bank, but from multilateral organizations that have been dealing with this issue. So this is a book that was born from a systemic complaint at the bank, at the IDB. We were always trying to do work, but there's no data, and we would like to know this about Paraguay, but the data's not there. And we want to do this project in Bolivia, and the data's not there. And this was a continuous question and a continuous complaint. And we realized that the quality of the analysis that we were making was way below what we could potentially be making because the data for this analysis was not there. Sure, for Mexico most of the time, for Brazil, for Colombia, but even for countries like Chile and Peru, which are among the top 5 countries in terms of income per capita in the region, a lot of the times we didn't find the data to do sort of basic analysis. Yes, most macro data, financial macro data, current account data, savings, investment, the broad aggregate, and thanks a lot to the work done by the IMF many years ago, is there. But if you wanted to look at more micro level data, about participation of women in the labor market, statistics on violence, household surveys that went beyond basic consumption, data on transit, data on almost any micro sense, firm level data. For most countries in the region, that data was actually not there. So after many years of complaining with Jose Antonio Mejia and the Department for Institutions at the bank, we decided to try to understand why this was so. And the premise of the book that Jose Antonio is going to present is that the reason this situation is there is not because of money. It is not because countries in Latin America don't have the resources to fund a statistical institute and to be able to actually collect data. Even countries like Honduras and even countries like Paraguay, which have low income per capita, the budgetary effort that is required to gather data is not significant, particularly relative to the rate of return on that data. So the premise is that this is not because of money, and it's even less because technological change has actually reduced substantially collecting data. Oh, sorry. Do I need to use this, or can I put it here? You need it here? Okay. So the point about money is really important because this is not a money issue. And technical change has actually made collecting data ever cheaper. Now, in some countries, you can actually, the people who collect data go around with their iPads that are connected to the internet. And as the data is being collected, they're collecting the data right on the iPad, and the data is being sent on real time to the statistical office, which is processing the data in real time. So there's not even paper involved. And you need a lot fewer enumerators than you needed in the past. So if the premise, this problem that we all suffer is not because of money, and why is it then? So the book is an attempt, and Jose Antonio is going to expand a little bit more, is an attempt to understand why is it that the demand for data is not converted into actual action by government in producing data when money is not the reason why it's not. And so we're in the presence of a public good, but it's a public good that's kind of weird because it also implies some limits on governments. Because when the data is published, the public good is produced, but at the same time, something is said about government performance, about how many doctors are in the health clinics, and about how many policemen are actually relative to the numbers of crimes. And so it enhances accountability, and you can see why now the political economy of this becomes a little complex. So let me stop there so that we can actually present what the book has to say. The book is 10 case studies about 10 different countries in Latin America. It was put together by some authors within the bank, some authors outside of the bank. It's a research project from the bank, and the idea is to help us all understand this problem and hopefully eventually to make something to do and improve it better. So thank you, Amanda, and I don't know where Jose Antonio is. I think he's making the presentation.
Let's see, do I need to use this? No. All right. So I'll give it back. Well, good morning to everyone. Thank you very much to the Center for Global Development, Amanda in particular, for welcoming us this morning and for hosting this event. Thank you, Santiago, for the introduction and the support through the years for this project. Thanks to Cheda, Roberto, and Matthew for agreeing to comment on this book. Thank you for all of you that are present here and for those connected to the live stream and to the 10 countries that participated in the research project. And particularly thanks to Eduardo Dargent, Gabriela Lota, Gilberto Moncada, who are the co-authors of this book. And just in line with what Santiago was saying, I think that data is like water. We use it in many days and we use it every day. And yet, we only think of it when it is not there, or we think of it when it's of bad quality. And just like we take water for granted and expect it to come out of the faucet every time we open it, we take data for granted. And we expect to open a website and just find the data right there. We seem to forget that behind those numbers, behind those flows, there's a complex process, and there are complex institutions. And these institutions, the national statistical offices, is where the IDB is focusing with this study. We decided to embark on a research to understand not the technical part of this institution, but more the organizational part and the way they work in their relationship with society and with the rest of government. So today I will present to you this book that, as Santiago says, is the product of many years of research, and it's called Who Wants to Know? The Political Economy of Statistical Capacity in Latin America. I will divide my presentation in 3 parts. First, the conceptual methodological framework that serves as a guide for the case studies, then the findings from these 10 case studies that we did in the same number of countries, and finally some recommendations and conclusions for the way ahead. And as I said, the book analyzes the political economy of statistical capacity from the perspective of the study of the capacity of the state, but applying this perspective to the study of specifically the national statistical offices, the NSOs. The conceptual framework of the book starts by indicating that while the study of the capacity of the state focuses on two dimensions, resources and autonomy, in order to study national statistical offices, it's necessary to focus in another dimension, coordination. And that's because the NSOs have the responsibility to conduct and to organize and regulate the work of the national statistical systems. These dimensions determine how the NSO interacts and works within the state, but it's also necessary to understand how the work of the NSO impacts the capacity of the state. So as you can see in this graph, the capacity of the NSO is determined by the political economy on the context in which the NSO exists. This capacity translates into the ability to produce data. This data impacts the overall capacity of the state, and then the capacity of the state feeds back to the capacity of the NSO. And this is key because, as expected, the level of development of an NSO, of a National Statistical Office, is correlated to the level of development of the government in that state. However, what the book shows is that the technical specialization of these institutions gives them the opportunity to become islands of efficiency in the government. That is, to have a higher level of development than the rest of the institutions of the state. And it's exactly understanding this divergence that was one of the objectives of the book. And to do it, the authors analyzed 10 case studies in the 10 countries listed in this map in Latin America, which have very different levels of statistical capacity. And there are three levels of analysis for the results of the books, organized from general to specific. First, common historical factors, processes that are found in many of the case studies. Second, the political economy factors that have some similarities around some of the case studies. And finally, the country-specific elements that reflect the experience of particular institutions. So let's start with some of the common historical processes that have strengthened statistical capacity across the region in these 10 countries that we looked at. Many NSOs can trace their origin to the emergence in the 1960s and 70s of developmentalist states that put an emphasis on planning. And this emphasis on planning resulted in an investment in statistical production. More recently, these institutions have gotten a boost with the advent of better quality social policies, such as conditional cash transfer programs. Social policies that imply a very high demand for data and hence, again, an investment in data production. Another positive impact came from the increase in demand for data with a higher level of geographical disaggregation that came as a result of the decentralization processes that some countries underwent. In the 80s and 90s, the democratization process in the region implied a push for greater transparency, which had a positive impact in statistical capacity. However, there are also some common historical processes in the region that had a negative impact on statistical capacity. Among them, the economic crisis of the 1980s, which weakened bureaucracies and the state in general, and the fiscal reforms of the 90s, which reduced the number of statistical agencies within line ministries, and sometimes it also implied a reduction in budgets for the national statistical offices. Moving on to the political economy factors, let me highlight a couple. As said earlier, the statistical capacity of the NSO is directly correlated to the capacity of the rest of the state, of the rest of the government. So the existence of technical institutions within the government that demand data has a positive effect on statistical capacity. Another element that has a positive effect is the international demand and international cooperation. We see that the active participation of multilateral agencies has an important impact on statistical capacity. And let me mention just two examples. The need to fulfill certain requirements to be part of an organization, such as the OECD, or the need to be part of the IMF's specialized data dissemination standard implies the need to invest in data, in better data and in data production. Or in other levels of development, the need to report progress in certain areas, such as it was with the Millennium Development Goals, and as it will be with the Sustainable Development Goals, it's an incentive for countries to have more resources into national statistical offices. Other political economic factors that impact are, the effects of political crises in particular countries. The high levels of demand from outside of the government are very relevant to increase the statistical capacity. And having a high-level champion that believes in data can can influence the statistical capacity in a positive or a negative way, depending on the mood of the champion. We saw that in a couple of the case study where the president of the country got directly involved in some cases, in pushing it, and in some cases, limiting the development of statistical capacity. Finally, the more specific findings from the study refer to elements that are in direct control of the National Statistical Office. And among them are, that a way to increase statistical capacity is for the NSO to build alliances with data users outside of the state, such as academia, civil society, and the private sector. And because of the technical nature of the work that the NSOs do, there is a strong international community of national statistical offices, and it is important for local national statistical offices to take advantage of this as a way to reinforce their knowledge and resources, to take advantage of what this community has to offer. Specifically in terms of the role of leaders and managers within these agencies, they can take advantage of opportunities to influence decision makers and push for better institutional frameworks, giving particular opportunities when they see particular opportunities. And managers and bureaucrats can also use the technical expertise of the NSO to make it essential for the rest of government, since no other institution usually in the country has the technical capacity to produce the data that the NSO produces. In terms of recommendation, the book proposes the following. I'm going to mention some. One is to promote modern legal frameworks for NSOs. In Latin America, and I see as we see in the rest of the world, we have legal frameworks from the 40s and 50s. They are really behind times, even with dealing with a simple factor how to store data, and they talk about having to store paper for 10 years or 15 years. And this modernization of the legal frameworks is important because it's very relevant for the coordinating role of the NSO within the national statistical system, and also for its interaction with data producers outside of the government. Another recommendation is to improve the use of administrative data, the original big data. First we have to concentrate on the things that we already have in hand. Another one is to encourage the alignment to international standards. Aligning to international standards can serve as a protective barrier for these offices. So when somebody questions the definition of unemployment or the way the CPI, the price index is measured, one can make a reference that this is because such and such international organization defines unemployment or the price index in such a way. Another one is to promote a dialogue among data producers and users. It's necessary that the supply of data is relevant to data users. It's necessary to promote transparency in data production and to increase data dissemination. And at the end of the day, what we want is to strengthen a culture of statistics, what some call data literacy. A culture of statistics that encourages the creation of a critical mass of data users outside of the government. It's not only, the statistical office have to depend not only on the demand from within the state, but also from the demand outside of the state. And it is this demand outside of the states that in the case studies proves to be very relevant. Of course, these recommendations are drawn from the experience in these 10 countries, but we hope that they can be applied to other places in the world. And of course, there are challenges, and among them, the incorporation of new technologies in the data production process. It is necessary to understand that technology is a tool, but it's not the goal. Another challenge is the adoption of innovation. In general, what we see is that national statistical offices are very conservative and cautious when it comes to change the way things are done. Santiago was mentioning the use of tablets for data collection. Recently, in the last year, in Latin America, we saw 2 countries that went back to doing the census like it was done 50 years ago, where everybody had, there was nobody could move from their houses, and they had to stay in their houses for one whole day while an army of 500,000 people went through the country collecting data. Another challenge is, that there's a need to consolidate the coordinating role of the NSO in the national statistical system. And if I have, to conclude, there's one key message. Demand is fundamental. Hence, users are essential, and users, when we talk about users not only within the government, but particularly users outside of the government and outside of the country. But demand needs to be stimulated. There needs to be a flow of information so that users can take advantage of it. And what is needed is the existence of a critical mass of individuals and institutions that will complain when data is not released according to a pre-agreed calendar. Individuals and institutions that will protest when methodological changes are not transparent and discussed. Individuals and institutions that will grumble when a statistical product is not funded. The NSOs need grievers that will cry when bad things happen, and fans that will support them in good times. When a new question is introduced in the census without without consultation or a survey is not funded anymore, this is what I would like to see in the streets. Really a mass of users that are willing to protest and to defend the statistical agencies. Thank you.
So you're suggesting that data revolution take to the streets, no longer in the conference halls. Okay. Great, so let's get a round of sort of general responses to what you've heard and read so far related to this report. I was struck by the emphasis on user groups and how that creates a constituency for the accuracy and availability of data. One of those constituencies are organizations like the Inter-American Development Bank or the World Bank or the IMF. So maybe you could reflect first on that big finding with this role of standards, user groups. Maybe you could also talk a little bit about how this would compare to other parts of the state. Maybe I can start with you. Sure. Matthew's a professor, an associate professor at American University who's focusing on state capacity and looking at NSOs in that context.
Definitely. Well, first of all, congratulations on the really marvelous book. I think that Jose Antonio would never say it this way, but the key message here is there needs to be proselytizing by international bodies. And I think part of the reason for that is that state capacity is both de jure and de facto. And so in order to actually achieve statistical capacity, it's not just sufficient to have laws on the book. We saw this in Argentina. There's a case study on Argentina in the book, which is marvelous, looking at what happened with INDECE and the degree to which the laws on the books didn't change, but the de facto rules did. And so I think that proselytizing, creating the client base, which Jose Antonio mentioned, is really essential to making this happen. And in terms of de facto guarantees of statistical capacity, legitimacy is central. So there's the demand side, and there's giving legitimacy to the statistical agency because we know that the results are credible and because we know that they're replicable.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll go to Shaida now. Shaida Badier is the CEO of Open Data Watch, but she was also the Data for Development Director at the World Bank for many years. Can you reflect a little bit? You've both been you're civil society now. You were the World Bank before. How do you see this issue of users and the constituency? How does it relate to capacity?
Well, thanks, Amanda. And first of all, congratulations to IDB and, of course, to Jose Antonio. This has been this is really a terrific book because as I've been long time, maybe close to 40 years now in the business of data and capacity building. And I think we really need to take a fresh look at this, and we need a reform. Some of us are advocating for what we call statistical capacity development 4.0. And that, as part of that, we really need to look at, we've been very much focusing on the production side and the technical side of capacity building, what I call this sort of in the value chain of data, very much at the production level, rather than going more into the uptake and impact and policy And for doing that, for getting the data and the value of data down to the value at the impact level, you really need to be much more smarter about understanding the political economy of data and the context of data. And believe me, it comes from a lot of experience in the field that if you ignore it, you basically, it's like, you produce a machine that you really don't know what its use is going to be. So I think this really sheds light on the importance of the demand side, importance of users, importance of building leadership for statistical capacity building. And I hope also the time, I think, is right, because a lot of organizations, UN and countries, are thinking about reforming the statistical systems to respond to SDGs. So I think it would be really a good time to advocate within organizations like the World Bank, OECD, UN, even IMF, of taking these factors much more into the consideration in designing their capacity development work.
Absolutely. And I mean, making sure that capacity development work is adequately financed and prioritized is obviously a key part of that. And we'll come back to that issue with you and Jose Antonio. But Roberto, what about, so we've talked about standards as a kind of pull mechanism to get better accuracy and availability of data. You've been doing some work at the IMF on this very topic. Do you want to reflect on that and how that's worked in Latin America?
Yeah. First of all, let me congratulate Jose Antonio and the IDB for an excellent book. I think, in my opinion, this is probably the first time an institution such as the IDB looks at this in a very structured way. The second thing I would like to say is that we pretty much agree with all the conclusions and findings of the book. I think the emphasis on the legal and institutional framework is right on, the same resources, and the topic of interagency collaboration is essential. I would like to perhaps take a different view with regard to the users. And this has to do with what Santiago was saying in his remarks. Today I would argue that the demand for statistics is infinite. Everyone wants more statistics of every kind. You can ask every minority group in every country and they have their own agenda for statistics. But I think that there is a ranking of users, and I would put at the top of the ranking the policymakers. Traditionally, the resources in statistics have been relatively scarce, and the ministers, the cabinet, and the president have preferred that the statistical offices, not only the NSO, but also the statistical office at the central bank, at the different ministries, focus on the data that are needed to formulate policymaking. And so, from that point of view, I am not so sure that we have plenty of resources to do everything that is needed. In our case, in the case of the fund, we have, since the 1950s, we have been providing capacity development everywhere, trying to enable countries to calculate the balance of payments, the government finance statistics, the essential data that are needed to formulate and monitor financial and economic policies. Today, the demands that, not only in Latin America, I've heard the chief of the UK Statistical Office and the chief statistician of Canada essentially say that the demands they have from what we call today civil societies are enormous. And frankly, not all policymakers agree that with the agendas of these different groups. I would also postulate that Latin America is not identical to Europe, to the UK, to Canada, to Australia when it comes to social and cultural conditions. What is possible in those countries may not be possible or preferable today in Latin America. So one needs to take that into account.
And let me push you a little bit on that, on the role of the international organizations in keeping that focus on policymakers at the center. It's good to have the standards, and the standards themselves a protective factor against political meddling, for example. But let's take, for example, the 2011-2012 Argentina inflation. This is a famous case where sort of everyone knew there was a problem with the numbers, but it wasn't the international organizations that came out and said something about that core statistic of total value to policymakers as well as other groups in society. So what is the role of the international organizations when it comes to this kind of data? Has it changed over time?
I would say that both the case of Argentina and the case of Greece are very notable in the last 10 years. In both cases, the statisticians were not doing what they should have been doing because of political influence. And so I completely agree with the postulates in the book that professional independence is essential. But professional independence has to be framed in the broader context of, the politics and the culture of society. In the case of Argentina, it was not, or even today, is not an independent agency, and we know what happened. In the case of Greece, it was a prerequisite for accession to the EU to have an independent statistical office. But in both cases, regardless of what the independence of the agency, the statisticians did not do the job they were supposed to do. I mean, I'm not talking about the technical people, but the agency as a whole. So what is the role of the international institutions? Well, apart from continuing to provide capacity development, in the case of the IMF, I have to say that we played an important role in the case of Argentina. We censured Argentina. And also in the case of Greece, it was a key element of the program whereby we, together with the Europeans, gave resources to the government to eliminate this political interference. Even though that this is in the program, we were not totally sufficient in changing the minds of the politicians, particularly because the new head of the statistical office continued to be, and even still today, is fighting accusations that, in our view, are not well-founded.
That's really
Can I add something?
Yes, go ahead.
Just adding something to what you just mentioned, I think the international organizations have a very complex but very important role in this ecosystem right now. And for me, first and foremost is for them to be very good, responsible users of data. A lot of organizations that we, from the CSO side, we monitor usage. The usage, and it's not really obvious whether some of the policies that are being made or decisions being made is based on what information, and making that information also available and open and accessible. So that's being responsible users, I think, goes a long way. The other thing is that more and more we see that the private sector taking data really seriously as a sector in their, you know best. But international organizations have not yet taken development data as a serious sector in their work. We don't even trace it. It's not even a marker for statistics and data. Hardly any of, except for IMF maybe, any other organizations talk about data at the board level, at sort of a strategy for data. So data is still sort of a back room kind of a operation. So development data needs to come to forefront and needs to be part of the strategic decision making of the organizations. And finally, it has to be part of the discussions with the countries. IMF does that from time to time. IMF, in their dialogue with countries, data is brought up. But I was at the World Bank for 36 years. It's not really discussed very seriously with the country operations and built part of the capacity building. I must say, at the end of the day, the 5 key donors for statistics do try to bring data into their operations work. And some of you know that the top donors, of course, change. Right now, they are the World Bank, European Commission, and Eurostat, UNFPA, Canada, and African Development Bank. Some of us are surprised not to see the UK in that list, but they were there, but it's just been shifting. But so there are, efforts to increase the resources, but we have a long way to go for data to become part of the DNA of these organizations.
Can I just complement that because Masoud is here? A few years ago, I was working at the IMF as head of the Technical Assistance Office, and we invited Masoud to deliver some remarks to donors I am pleased to report to you, Masood, that donors have been very good at providing resources, including for statistical development. So we do that.
And so on this issue of resources, since the conversation has gone in this direction, do you think that the amount of money that we are investing in good data systems right now, how does that fit with the value of data as we know it for policy and things like that? Or do you have any responses to the comments that have just been made?
I would just add, and I think I'll ask the practitioners to tackle this, but one of the things that this book does is point out that there are a lot of ways that international organizations can contribute here. And if you think about it in terms of a hierarchy of needs, resources is the first need. Santiago said maybe we don't need as many resources. The case studies in this book are really remarkable. There are 10 different country case studies, and they do suggest that for some of the smaller and poorer countries, resources are an issue. Then you move up, I think, to the second level, which is knowledge and training, which international organizations can contribute significantly to providing that. And then third, and this is where I think for the middle-income countries in the hemisphere, perhaps international organizations can play the biggest role, and that is the legitimacy, the legitimizing data, providing some idea of what the need is here for data. I use the term proselytizing. Maybe that's not a good term, but I do think showing domestic audiences why they should care about having an independent or at least autonomous national statistical office.
So maybe, Pepe, we'll turn back to you now. We've talked about money, but what about the capacity building itself? What does good capacity look like? How did the countries do vis-a-vis one another? What are the factors that you think drive capacity beyond, in addition to the things that you were discussing as part of your presentation?
Well, one of the things that the 10 case studies show is the importance of human resources in these institutions. The level of specialization that these institutions need implies that the human resources are very highly trained, and that training a lot of times is relied on two things: on experience and on the training provided by international organizations or peers. There's a lot of South-South cooperation. So in that sense, capacity can be seen through the eye of their human resources. Then it comes, an issue of the investment in technology, and they need to be up to date in the use of advanced information technology. And we have seen it, and one of the case studies mentions, the statistical offices were one of the first institutions to use computers in the early ages. And in many cases, we see two countries in Latin America that have an eye in their statistical office because they were one of the responsibilities was to guide information technology policy in the country. Such was their advance on the use of computers and such that they had to provide assistance.
Which country is the most advanced technologically right now? And can you give us an example of what that looks like?
Well, the two clear leaders in the region, and they have proven it. Sheila and Roberto, they have been to the Statistical Commission of the United Nations, and they are leaders not only in the region but across the globe are Brazil and Mexico. But there's also, this leadership not only shows in a slow movement, but also there's leadership in having, in pioneering. In that sense, Colombia has been pushing for, to be a leader in the use of technology. In 2005, Colombia was the first country, probably one of the first in the world to use PDAs at that moment, to capture data for their census. And now they are actually using internet-based census data entry for, experimenting. But then at some point, somebody has to make these experiments in order for others to learn.
Yes, sadly, Colombia did not win its World Cup match today, but they are winning on statistics, which is good. Although, let me ask you this about one of the things in Latin America that has happened frequently is a lot of investment in a census, for example, and then the political authorities, whether it be Congress or others, not willing to use the results of that census to allocate resources, for example, amongst states or voting districts. And that's obviously not a problem that is only in Latin America, but in other parts of the world, including places where we sit today. Can you say something a little about that? You know, that comes to mind when you think about a political economy consideration. Is that a capacity problem? Is it a political, you know, how do you see that issue through the lens of the case studies that you've done?
Well, I think one of the questions that is on the table, and not only from this research but from before, is and it's a discussion that at least we had at the IDB about 20 years ago when the IDB started financing or giving loans to finance censuses. Is this an expenditure or an investment? So we had to argue that this was an investment. That just like you spend on a road network, you need to spend on an infrastructure of data for policy making, to make decisions. But now that we have argued that it is an investment, the next question that is on the table is, what is the value? What is the return on that investment? And of course, the return of that investment is linked to the usage of the data. And I think in that sense, that is something that the book points out, and is this promotion on the use of data. Sometimes the statistical offices say, okay, here's the data, my job is done. And I think there is more need, and I think the statistical offices need the support from international organizations. Okay, you look, you are allocating resources, based on data from 15 years ago. The inequity, the inefficiency of that, and you need to do another census, or you need to use more recent information to make that allocation.
That, I don't know, it just always made me mad.
Yes.
We would spend $40 million on a lending project and then not to see that used for resource allocation. Shaida, you're talk a little bit about that and also the civil society perspective on this.
Right. I think that's really that breaks my heart too, and that's why I'm doing the work that I'm doing right now, because we're finding out more and more that with all the value or all the investments in data, they're locked up. Locked up doesn't mean that they just need to make data available through PDF and then they've done the job. It's really for data to become valuable and used. You have to walk it to the users. You have to make the data accessible. They have visualization. There would be terms of use, so the users know how to use it, what's their right, and so on. What's the privacy issues? So data production doesn't end when you have the data. You really have to go further steps to get the data ready. And that's one of the things that in the old model of capacity building, a lot of us did not pay as much attention to. We said, build it, they will come. And it doesn't happen. You really have to do much more. So that's one of the learnings that also the book confirms, that we need to take to this new capacity development approach.
Yeah. Roberto, speaking of making data available, I think, was it a year or more ago that you came and talked about the requirement as part of some of IMF programs to make the data open in addition to following the standard. Do you want to talk about progress so far and any effects you've seen of that increasing availability?
Yeah, what I referred at that time was the approval in 2015 by the board of a change in one of our standards, the General Data Dissemination System, which originally in the late 90s had been intended to stimulate development, but it had a problem, and the problem was that it assumed that once the statistical office developed, they would automatically disseminate the data. That never happened. So since that, I mean, we're talking about 100 countries that are less statistically advanced. So since then, we have been working with authorities of at least 40 countries now, and mostly in Africa, but also in the Middle East. We partner with Jose Antonio in the case of Paraguay to make sure that authorities can publish in a website first what we think is the data that are essential for policy making, but also to allow the authorities a platform to publish other data that they might believe is important. For example, data that might be needed by the IDB or the SDGs and so on. That process continues. Recently, in March this year, the board approved a new overarching strategy on data and statistics at the fund. that has a vision that we call the Global Data Commons, which is essentially, we feel that perhaps in 5 years we can have a network of what we call the NSDPs, that is these websites that disseminate data that we feel are necessary for the fund to conduct its business, and for others to monitor economic conditions and policies in a disciplined manner, that is in accordance to agreed dissemination, timeliness, and periodicity. We feel that once the 189 countries of the world are publishing this data immediately upon release in the same format, that will allow not only the local audiences, but rating agencies, international banks, and so on, everyone to have the best data possible.
Interesting. So we're about to go to you in the audience, so prepare yourselves. But Matthew, can you reflect a little bit on, independently as an academic, I know you're also a contributor to this book, but how well do you think that the international institutions do at acknowledging and managing the political economy of statistics and statistical capacity building?
Well, it's been a real learning experience, and I appreciate the opportunity that Jose Antonio provided to participate in the project. I guess one of the things that I was struck by in this book, and I highly recommend that everybody read the case studies, is that there are 10 case studies here, and that's something that I think only the IDB could do in such a short time period. But what's fascinating is the 10 case studies they come to completely different conclusions. So 10 countries, 10 problems. And, I kind of in the early stages imagined that there would be 10 case studies and then we'd have a taxonomy of the problems. And instead of that, there's a really, I think that the political economy is so complex that every country is different. One thing that we haven't talked about, though, that came out of the case studies is the necessity for something that Jose Antonio mentioned in his talk, which is coordination. And I was struck in some of the case studies by the fact that national statistical offices oftentimes are given an impossible task of overseeing the entire national statistical system. And so this gets to issues of state capacity across the whole of government, but it also gets to very complex political issues. And this is a place where I think that the case studies are very rich, and I highly recommend reading about them. To see how some countries have dealt with that. Not all countries, obviously, have been able to deal with them effectively yet, but I think that this is a place where the comparative learning will be helpful.
Okay. Yeah.
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
Because I totally agree with what you say, but I would add the following. I remember in particular what the book says about some central banks, the Central Bank of Guatemala, El Salvador, and so on. And what you say, the complex politics and perhaps the competition between the several elements of the statistical system. Here, I would emphasize the point of finding ways to ensure the statistical office can collaborate effectively with the other institutions of government. This is more difficult than one would expect. The difficulties have to do with jealousies, political competition, but also, very importantly, with the different relativities across the government. For example, typically the central bank has a higher level in the hierarchy, better salaries, and more resources. The statistical offices tend to have less. And so there is sometimes some jealousy, some problems that are difficult. What we have found is that in these situations, formalizing data sharing agreements, ensuring that the statistical office can access, for example, tax information or central bank information is essential. Without that, progress is difficult.
Yeah, let's just drill down a second on this issue of independence and the role of the different agencies within government. As your remarks and the book points out, it's not really clear whether independence is a requirement to be able to do better on high quality statistics or even statistical capacity. On the other hand, it seems essential and helpful in other cases. But I remember when we were working on this data for African Development Report, I did kind of fantasize about the central bank model for national statistical organizations. Is that feasible, or is it just a fantasy? Obviously, the Mexican case of INEGI is really interesting. The governance arrangements around it are really interesting. Do you want to reflect on that, Jose Antonio?
Well, I think the model of the central bank is always great, but the thing is that they have a printing press.
And they have money. I know they have their own source of revenue.
And that is
right.
The basement.
and that does. That it makes a big difference.
Yeah.
No, in that you make a reference to the Mexican case. When the new law was discussed, there's only one level of independence that INEGI was not able to achieve, was financial independence.
Right.
No, the budget of INEGI has to go straight through the Ministry of Finance, unlike other autonomous institutions like the National Electoral Institute. Mm-hmm. So yes, I guess it is easier said than done. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, when this discussion is on the table, people seem to confuse autonomy with autarky. One thing is to work independently, and another one is to work completely separately and have no dialogue with the users. And I think as the statistical office has this role of coordinating, it is important that there are these channels of communications, very clear channels of communication with the rest of the agencies in the government.
Mm-hmm. Do you anyone else?
Well,
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, it's just one thing. I think before thinking what model works like central bank, I think the fundamentals of what to make a good in modern statistical office, and the book talks about it. And one of the things that really strike me as important is, I know it sounds cliche, but increase your users base. Mm-hmm. And that increase in the user base gives you a legitimacy. Mm-hmm. It gives you those informal barriers and protecting you from, becoming independent. Mm-hmm. It makes you famous. It makes you independent from the changing administrations and so on. So it would be good to find those sort of important buttons that makes the statistical office really a well-functioning statistical office, and then leave it for finding out how it should organizationally exist.
Yeah, maybe fame of your national statistician actually might be important, right? To protect you from
the leadership.
Yes, we've seen that in some countries. Robert, do you want to mention
No,
about this topic?
this is a fascinating topic. The Canadian model is very interesting, which is a mixed model. Mm-hmm. But in the end, it all comes to the same thing. I think that it is reasonable to expect that if you're the national statistician, there is a ranking of users and consumers of data, and the most important one is the Minister of Finance and the central bank. If you want to do something else other than what they want, you may be in trouble.
You have troubles, yes, absolutely.
I challenge that.
We'll fight that out later. Matthew, you worked a lot in Brazil. Do you want to reflect on NUPEA and its role?
No.
All right.
No, but I will say this. I think, yes, statistical offices are seldom like the central bank. They don't have the power of the judiciary, but that doesn't mean that they're powerless. And when we think about autonomy of bureaucratic agencies, oftentimes it's esprit de corps that gives bureaucrats the ability to push back against political pressure. And obviously, external audiences are important, but so too are the simple de facto and de jure protections for civil service tenure, for civil service salaries, the things that make people stick around and turn them into experts. And so I think, it's a combination of reaching outward, but also providing the guarantees inwardly that protect bureaucrats and enable them to push back against pressures.
That's a really, really important point. The deep state. No, not that.
I was going to use that.
I was going to say that. Okay, so let's go to the audience now for questions. We'll take 3 and then come back. So, you started, so we'll start over here. Please say who you are and what organization you're from.
Hi, my name is Nicolas Saldias, and I work at the Wilson Center. And I have a question regarding Argentina. I know it's one of the case studies. Argentina was a highly politicized case of statistical manipulation. And it was an election issue in 2015 with Macri. And the country went through an emergency, a statistical emergency for the first 6 months, I believe, of the year. And so I wonder if any of you could talk about the role that international institutions have played in helping Argentina transition back to a legitimate, I guess you could say, statistical agency? And also, what lessons have you learned from that experience for future cases, like, for example, Venezuela, which almost certainly would face this even worse situation?
Great question. Right behind you, and then.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Ben Rosetta, I work at the IDB. And this question is mainly for Roberto, but I'm happy to hear the opinions of others. You talked about the importance of the Minister of Finance and the role that he or she plays in making the budget allocation decisions, and the importance that he or she assigns to official statistics. Jose Antonio and I have spent some time reflecting about what kind of arguments would be most persuasive to this important figure within government, who at the end of the day is very influential in determining what kind of support is given to statistics offices and everything else in the expenditure portfolio. And I think statistics offices are kind of at a disadvantage when comparing to other budget items. Take an airport. The airport is really visible. It's big, it's shiny.
Right.
And the volume is just huge. And also, it comes from a sector that is highly experienced in doing cost-benefit analyses. So you can hire an economist, you can say, give me a return on investment, projected ROI for this airport. And you can get that number. And the number is going to be astronomical, probably. But in statistics, we don't have such a tradition, and also it's never going to be big and shiny in the same way that an airport is. So my question for you is, what kind of arguments would be most persuasive to the Minister of Finance? Is the key finding an ROI kind of argument, or is there something else that would really resonate to put it on the same plane as the airport type of case? Thank you.
Is data as good as airports? Over here. Sorry. Okay, let's go. Actually, the person right next to you, since you're standing there. Yeah, and then yellow.
My name is Kenan Scott. I work at the World Bank. Congratulations to Jose Antonio. Much of what this book says resonates very well with me. We've worked in this area for a long time. I have a comment and a question. So one of the comment is on the data users, just to differ a little with the panel, is that creating that data user group is not just to create more demand for different data. It's actually to, A, get the data that's there used. It creates, governments come and go. Some are more open, some are more closed, et cetera. If you create a community of data users, they don't let you shut the door. I mean, I think that the data users aren't creating more demands on the system to create, this database, that database, the other one. They actually just want to see the basic data, that the same data that the Minister of Finance wants to see, the same data that the Ministry of Education wants to see. I think if you create that group of people, those, the academics, the think tanks, civil society, you create something that will do better at pushing the conversation with the Minister of Finance going forward than just chatting with him. On the question, in the Africa region, there are 4, I think, or 5 statistical institutes, of training institutes, not National Statistics Office, but institutes that their job is to train other statisticians. And I've always wondered why they do it at the sort of short courses, technical training courses. They have bachelor's degree, master's, some of them now have PhD level courses. And I always wondered why Latin America never generated that kind of a system. INEGI plays the role a little bit, but not really. They don't have programs of their own. They're just sort of a center that other people use. So I was curious if anybody has any insights on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Right behind you in the yellow shirt.
Congratulations. My name is Jose Antonio Escamilla. I'm kind of representing PAHO, the Pan-American Health Organization. I like many things. First of all, I like your analogy of the DNA, how to and in that regards, PAHO this year kind of did some surgery there, and we have now trying to push up all the issue of data and data use also for health analysis and stuff like that. So I'm really hoping, I'm dying to see the book, the case studies, because probably I'm going to find some clues on how to increase these constant questions on how the role of international agencies can be working together and improving all these, not only data availability and quality, but also the use of that. So my question very quickly is, if you, because I haven't seen the case studies, if you pay some specific look at the health sector of, I don't know if you can mention something about this, because, of course, for us, it's kind of our main counterpart in the countries.
I am happy to answer your question later. Okay.
I can answer.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Tina Faulkner. Thank you so much for the presentation. I work for the Department of Labor's International Bureau, specifically the Office of Child Labor, Forced Labor, and Human Trafficking. And we don't have a lot of money, but we have been funding supporting sort of standalone and modular surveys on child labor and forced labor in some countries. And I was really interested in the comment that you made during your talk, Jose Antonio. You said that sometimes it can be difficult to get the data published and get it out there because it might make people look bad. It might be difficult for the government to want to sort of show its dirty laundry. This is obviously an issue that we deal with a lot, and so I would just be interested in hearing any more thoughts you have about that, if you had any examples of successes in sort of convincing that in the long run, having that data out there would be beneficial. So thank you.
The bad news question. And Santiago, do you want to give the last comment, and then we'll go back to the panelists?
Sort of a comment on the expanding the base of demanders or the demand base for data. I think an important factor in the region is the role of congresses, because now many laws have rules for distributing resources like revenue sharing formulas on a per capita basis, depending on the population or the income level of the states. So clearly Congress has a stake in having good data to apply these revenue sharing formulas. And many countries also now have mandates to measure social indicators, to measure poverty, and to allocate some resources on the basis of poverty indicators. So the more this is done, and the more this filters into other laws, the more now there's an ally in the state, not exactly the finance ministry and the central bank, but also in the state, which are congresses, which are demanding that better data is there so they can sort of apply all these laws.
Yes. That is also a very interesting political economy issue. I hope you'll. Okay, so we have the very interesting question of the statistical emergency and what was done to support the Argentine authorities in their transition. Maybe, Roberto, we'll start with you, then ask you, Pepe, and then, what about Venezuela?
In 2014, I went to work for the statistics department in the fund, and I told my wife, good news, there's no statistical crisis. I was wrong, because there was one in Argentina. So what did the fund do? The fund has some constraints in a situation like this, because this is the case of the public, the international community, even political parties accusing the government of lying and manipulating the data. I think the IMF, like other international organizations, work with the government. We don't work with anyone else. We go and work with authorities, and so it's a difficult, sensitive matter to say, we suspect you're lying. Open the book so we can check. In that particular case, it took 7 years, 6.5, for the authorities to let us look a little bit at what they were doing. And even then, after working with them to the extent that they allow us, working with others, we could not find how they were doing it. We realized it only once the new government came in. And I have been arguing in the fund that we need to learn a lesson here. My colleagues are still not where I am in this area. I think that there are situations where the onus of proof should not be with the fund staff, but with authorities. Now, the only specific lesson that is being applied today is that users are very important, and we recommended to Tedesca, the new head of INDEC, that he should form a council of users that will enable him to get an informed and perhaps even powerful view of the quality of the statistics and the credibility of the statistics. One other lesson that I would take from Argentina is the following. If you see in any country that there is a competition for the CPI or for GDP, that there are others producing data, and that people are paying for that data, there is a problem. That is there is a market test here.
Yeah.
If if the public doesn't believe you and they are buying the data for someone else, there is a problem.
That, interesting. Maybe we can add that to the index. Although I think in the US we have a lot of groups that do that. Pepe, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I think when we were looking for the case studies, of course, part of the possibility was the agreeability of the country to be subject to be a case study. And in the case of Argentina, it was the new administration that was willing to be a case. But as we were working on the case study, the professionals are indexed like, look, now we need to do this again, because Argentina truly became a success story of how things can turn around quickly. Whereas the other nine, there was no crisis on the other nine countries, so things are the same as they were. Here we really do see a big change, and I think that the role of international organizations was essential. Of course, you need the political support, and I was lucky to be there at the 50th anniversary of INDEC in January, and we had the president opening the ceremony, but we also had the head of the statistical department of the IMF, the head of the statistical department of the World Bank, and the head of the UN Statistical Division. And not only that, but also the head of the statistical department at the OECD. And there's a saying in Spanish that nobody's a prophet in his own land. I think, of course, these people came to say the same things that the director of INDEC was saying, but it wasn't the director of INDEC. It was the head of the statistical department of the OECD saying them. And in that sense, and going back to what Roberto was saying, the role has been more relevant for the OECD in Argentina because they don't have a stake. They are members of the World Bank, they are members of the IMF, so there's always that political sensibility. In the OECD, they want to be members of the OECD. So the INDEC has really used this as a leverage, for example, to push for a new law. And here I'm just going to, if you don't mind, quickly jump to Santiago's question about the congresses. One of the things that what we found on the case studies is that congresses in general do not play an important part. They should, but they don't. I mean, what we do see is a country that I'm not going to name, but it starts with a G, and it's part of the 10 case studies, that where the census, is the country is the country in Latin America that is more late in doing the census. And one of the reasons is that Congress did not want to allocate resources because that will mean different districts.
Yeah.
And it would mean that some of the members of Congress will lose their job.
Yeah.
So, and of course, there's relevance because I think one of the main things that needs to come out is that we need new legal frameworks that are modern, as I was saying, that have ways to protect the institutionality, with periods, serving periods for the directors of the statistical offices that do not match the political terms of presidents. But we don't see that much action, unfortunately, in the legislative branch as we would like to see.
Did you want to say something on that same topic, Roberto?
Well, I think I know what country he's talking about. The issue of, and I agree with everything you say, but the issue of security is also important. I was in that country about 12 years ago, and on the one hand, the private sector was saying, we want better statistics, and I was saying, well, in that case, you have to respond to the questionnaires and give information, and they would say, no, we are afraid we could be kidnapped, we could be, so the question of security is also an important question.
Interesting. What about the Ministry of Finance? What are the arguments that would be most persuasive when speaking to Ministry of Finance? Shaya, you earlier mentioned that having a constituency on the outside helps with budget negotiations. What else?
I think what I have seen is that certainly working with international institutions. When the IMF goes, and in fact, I can tell you very specifically, sometimes head of the statistical office feels that he needs more resources for this and for that. He calls the IMF and says, look, can you do an assessment? ROSC, we call it. We go, and the assessment usually will realize that there is, so we make a recommendation. He goes to the minister of the central bank head and says, look, the IMF is saying we need more resources. The same with the IDB or the World Bank. The IDB may say you need more resources for better education data, better health data, better hospital data. So they go and say, look, the World Bank came, the IDB came, and they told us, and the Ministry of Health is in agreement. So he needs to form a coalition, I think.
Yeah. So assessment as the way to understanding what the resource needs are. And Shaida, what about the role of data users? That was a question that it's governments come and go, data use communities are forever.
Yes, I really
or as
believe
long
that.
as your foundation funding lasts, right?
Absolutely. I think we've seen that the data users have played a huge role in capacity building for statistics. If you look back at some of the really successful sectors like national account, prices, and look back, you see that it started actually with researchers and like the Penn World Table, that's with Bob Summers and Alan Heston and those guys at the Penn University in 80s and 90s. Masood remembers those. They really were initiating demand and then the countries responded, the UN systems responded, IMF, methodological advancement. So users have a big role to play if it's done right. Sometimes the users and researchers set bad examples, because in my field of open data, they're guilty. Researchers hoard data, they don't make it open, so they also set a bad example. So it's not always bringing good things to the data ecosystem. But one group I think we haven't talked about much is the CSOs. The civil society organizations have a big role in this ecosystem. And we've seen, in response to some of the questions, that also adds the value as a user, but also as a sort of calling out issues that sometimes is difficult for IMF to raise because of their standing, or the World Bank, but CSOs can because of our independence. And in fact, for example, the gender data has been a big issue for many years, and it was a CSO, Data 2X, that started really putting this on the map, that we have a gender disaggregated data crisis. So users, CSOs, we need to partner with them and really bring them into active participants in this ecosystem.
Yeah, that's a really great point. What about the statistical capacity training institutes that we see elsewhere in the world? Why don't we see them in Latin America? I mean, it seems like the statistical institutes themselves actually serve that function. I guess the question is, how much funding or how much mandate do they have for those kinds of exchanges amongst themselves? Do you have a sense?
In the golden age of
Mekovi. Do you remember
for example,
Mekovi? Anyone here?
I do, yeah, and I'm sure
Remembers
Keenan
part of
remembers.
it, yeah.
Keenan knows, right?
It's a program to work on the standardization and use of household surveys in
And it
Latin
started
America.
from the users, from the researchers.
And it started from the users.
Yes.
No, but in Latin America in the 60s and 70s, first they have CELADE, which after a couple of years they had a master's in demography, and many of the older generation of demographers in statistical offices come from there. And there was another one that I cannot remember the name, but there were some, and again, it's an issue of, has turned out to, I think, an issue of funding, and also an issue that, as you said, some of the more advanced countries have taken that role. Colombia has a training institute, Peru has one, Mexico has one, and I think the community of statistical offices, the Statistical Conference of the Americas, is trying to informally have that without having without the need of a building, having these online training courses.
In the case of the IMF, I have to say that we do have considerable training on macroeconomic statistics for central banks, ministers of finance, and the statistical offices, including in association with the Banco Brazil. We have a regional training program there. I'm very confident that in this area, there is plenty of training for Latin America.
Plenty of supply and
Yeah.
demand, maybe. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on this? On bad news, what to do?
So I think that's a fascinating question, and it maybe points to the flip side of politicization. You know, bringing other communities in can be good in the long term, but it can also be damaging in the short term. I think of the literature on judicial independence, and I excuse my academic sort of meandering here, but in the literature on judicial independence, there's a thing called insurance theory, and it's that courts become independent when incumbents realize that even bad news can serve them in the long run, and the opposition realize that at some point they'll be in the incumbency, and therefore they should tolerate bad news when they're the incumbents because they can use bad news when they're in opposition. And so, I think that statistics is a little like this, right? That there are reasons why parties in Congress may want to encourage statistical autonomy, but there are reasons that incumbents may want to encourage it as well. The incumbent today may realize that if they tolerate bad news today, they'll be able to use bad news against their opponents when they're out of office. And that's sort of the general theory. Now, from theory to practice is hard, and there was this question about INDECI in Argentina, and it's really hard to think about INDECI in Argentina without reference to the broader political context of Argentina, which for the past 60 years has been, tacking from left to right, with hyper-presidential political system that makes it, a winner-take-all system. And so in that political context, what does politicization mean, and what does politicization of statistics mean? So there's sort of a sweet spot between too much politicization and perhaps too little, which means that statistical agencies aren't getting the attention that they deserve and that they need in order to build autonomy.
Yeah, I think that's really important to put the function of the NSO into the politics and the institutional structure that the countries are living in any moment. As you're right, it's just a symptom. It's not necessarily that there's anything about INDECI that could have changed that would have made a different outcome possible.
Yeah. And
So,
on that, I think there's just from just recent experience with INEGI. The law of INEGI states that in Mexico, the Statistical Office of Mexico, any survey that is conducted by INEGI is public by definition, unless it provides data that is confidential or personal information. In that sense, when an agency comes and wants to contract INEGI to conduct a survey, they know that in the contract it states that data is going to be public, regardless of if they like or not like the results.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like a smart policy then to protect independence and the ability to publish bad news. There was a question about administrative data in health, and you made the really great point that administrative data is the original big data, and we're not using it enough. And some of the countries in the region actually have amazing databases of hospitalization and prescriptions and utilization in general. The statistical system doesn't wrap their arms around all of that data at the moment. Maybe could you reflect a little bit on the connection, Scheider, Jose Antonio, on these big administrative data sets that are owned by ministries, and what's the role of the NSO vis-a-vis those ministerial data sets and using them, checking, triangulating data sources? What do you see as sort of best practice from your case studies?
Well, of course, education and health, and now social development are the three areas of the government that have the biggest data sets. And I think that goes, in one way, goes back to a legal issue of access to that information. In many cases, there are no agreements, or there's no ground to make those agreements for the statistical agency to have access to that information. From another perspective, the statistical agencies, as coordinator of the national statistical system, should be able to set the rules of, in conjunction with these line ministers of what are, what is the international standard we're going to follow on the definition of disease. And so I think, there is a lot of ground there. The issue also goes down to the fact that many of these line ministries now do not have a statistical department that can interact properly with the NSO. So you have a lot of well-intentioned people that manage a big amount of information, but only thinking from their administrative perspective, for fulfilling their needs, without thinking of it from the statistical potential that this data has.
Can you just speak to a little bit on, biometric ID is something that was really pioneered in Latin American countries, and this unique ID, it's so powerful for the use of administrative data and linking across ministries, and even thinking about increasing the efficiency of tax collection and things like that. Are you seeing privacy issues? Are you seeing governments tie up all these data sets together around that unique ID, or is that still to come?
No, we have seen some researchers at the IDB do it in some smaller countries, trying to put together, to match these huge data sets. Somebody once told me that it's not only that you need a unique ID, you need one unique ID. Because as a Mexican, I have like 4 unique IDs. So that is, of course, that is the future, and particularly, going back to the Ministry of Finance, a way to save money is if you would really have a population registry that encompasses everybody, where you could see that recipients of social benefits are not being duplicated.
Yeah.
And
Sweden. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, I think actually we're at time. So thank you to everyone who joined us. Thank you to the panelists for this great talk, and to the IDB. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
¿Cuánto? Just a uno.